The millionaire's son hadn't eaten for 30 days. Until the maid cooked what saved him for 30 days, the child of one of the richest men in the country refused every single meal. When the new maid prepared something simple, the boy ate and started talking. What seemed like a food blockage revealed a brutal scheme of chemical manipulation. From that dish onward, the clinic's castle of lies began to crumble. The mansion in Kensington had always had something oppressive about it. Edward Alastair had known it since the day he signed the purchase papers, 5 years ago, when his tech company finally reached the billion-dollar mark and he decided he needed an address that matched his success. The white walls, the high ceilings, the impeccable gardens designed by an award-winning landscape architect. Everything perfect, everything cold, everything exactly as it should be for a man who had built an empire from nothing. But that Thursday afternoon, as the driver parked the black Mercedes in the circular driveway, something different hung in the air. Edward felt it before he even got out of the car, a tightness in his chest, a nameless anxiety. He had cancelled a crucial meeting in New York, ignored 3 calls from his business partner, and caught the first flight back to London. He couldn't explain why. He just knew he needed to be home. Now. The silence that greeted him when he opened the main door was not the usual silence. It was different. It wasn't the absence of sound, but something suspended, as if the entire house were holding its breath. Edward dropped his Italian leather briefcase in the entrance hall and loosened his tie. His footsteps echoed on the cold marble as he crossed the living room toward the stairs. That's when he heard it. Michael's voice. Edward stopped in his tracks, one hand already on the banister. The sound was coming from the 2nd floor from his son's room, but it wasn't the sound he was used to hearing. It wasn't those disconnected grunts, those senseless murmurs that the doctors had said would be the most Michael would ever be able to produce. It was a voice, clear, articulated, saying words, real words. Edward's heart raced. He took the steps 2 at a time, soundlessly, driven by a mixture of hope and fear he couldn't comprehend. When he reached the 2nd floor landing, the door to Michael's room was ajar. The late afternoon light streamed through the windows, creating a golden hue that made everything feel unreal, like a scene from a movie. He approached slowly, holding his breath, and peered through the crack. Michael was sitting on the plush carpet, surrounded by colorful building blocks. He was 6 years old but seemed smaller, with those large dark eyes inherited from the mother who had left when he was just a few months old. The boy was holding a blue piece and looking intently at the woman in front of him. A woman Edward didn't immediately recognize. It wasn't Dr. Patricia Andrews, the behavioral therapist who had been treating Michael for 3 years. This was someone younger, dressed in simple clothes, her brown hair tied back in a ponytail. She was kneeling on the floor at Michael's eye level and smiling with a genuine sweetness that Edward hadn't seen directed at his son in a very long time. Helen, that was the name the cleaning agency had mentioned when they called last week to say they were sending a temporary replacement. He had barely paid attention. Such operational details of the house were never his concern. He paid people to take care of those things. But now, watching through the crack in the door, Edward saw something that left him paralyzed. Helen held a red block in her open palm and looked at Michael with infinite patience. There was no rush in her movements, none of that mechanical rigidity he always noticed in the therapists. There was something different, something warm, something human. Michael looked at the block, then at Helen, and then his mouth moved. Edward gripped the doorframe tightly. Red. The word came out clearly, though a little slurred. But it was a word. A real word, formed by those lips that experts said would never form complete sentences. Michael said red, and Helen smiled so radiantly it was as if the boy had just discovered the cure for cancer. Very good, Michael. Her voice was soft, encouraging. Now show me where the blue one is. Michael looked at the blocks around him, his forehead furrowed in concentration. It took a few seconds, but then his small hand reached for the blue block he'd been holding all along. He held it up, showing it to Helen, with the hint of a smile on his face. Edward felt tears burn his eyes. When was the last time he'd seen his son smile? When was the last time Michael had shown any emotion other than frustration or apathy? The sessions with Dr. Andrews always ended with Michael exhausted, distant, his glazed eyes fixed on some invisible point in space. But here, in this moment, his son was present, connected, alive. Helen picked up another block, this one yellow, and made a gentle gesture with her hands. And this one? What color is it? Michael looked. It took longer this time. Helen didn't rush him. She simply waited, with that seemingly infinite patience, as the boy processed the information. Finally, Michael opened his mouth. Yiwo. Almost, sweetie. Almost. Helen didn't correct him harshly. She just repeated the words slowly, smiling. Yellow. You're doing so well. So very well. Edward rested his forehead against the cool wood of the door. How was this possible? 3 years. 3 long years of intensive therapies, of consultations with the best specialists in London, in the UK, even a few from abroad. 3 years of grim diagnoses, of limited prognoses, of pitying looks and phrases like, "We need to be realistic about expectations." He had accepted it. God, how he had accepted it. He had accepted that Michael would never be like other children. He had accepted that the best he could do was ensure his son had every possible resource, the best professionals, the most advanced treatment. And he had taken refuge in his work, building empire after empire, because it was easier to conquer international markets than to face the pain of looking into his own son's eyes and seeing a lack of recognition. But now, watching Michael interact like that, something inside Edward broke. Or maybe it was finally beginning to heal. The bedroom door suddenly flew open, slamming against the wall with a bang that made Michael flinch, and Helen jumped to her feet. Dr. Patricia Andrews stormed in like a hurricane, her usually composed face now twisted in a mask of poorly concealed fury. "What is going on in here?" Her voice was sharp, cutting. She was a middle-aged woman, thin, always impeccably dressed in suits that resembled armor. Her small pale eyes swept the room, landing on Helen with barely disguised contempt, then on Michael, who immediately looked away and shrank back even further. Edward felt his chest tighten at his son's reaction. "Dr. Andrews, I was just—" Helen began, but was cut off. "You were just what? Interfering with a complex treatment that you have no qualifications to understand." The therapist strode into the room, completely ignoring Edward's presence at the door. She picked up a medical bag from the desk. "You're a cleaner. You should be cleaning, not playing therapist." Helen opened her mouth to respond, but her voice died when Patricia pulled a syringe from the bag, along with a glass vial. Edward saw the label from a distance. He recognized the name of the drug. It was the sedative Michael took before every therapy session. To reduce his anxiety, Patricia always explained, to make him more receptive to the exercises. But Michael didn't look anxious now. He looked terrified. "No." Edward's voice came out before he could think. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. "Don't give him that now." Patricia blinked, surprised to see him there. "Mr. Alistair, I didn't realize you were back." She quickly composed her professional expression. "Michael needs his medication. He's agitated." "He's not agitated." Edward stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on his son. Michael was indeed frightened, but not agitated. There was a stark difference that Edward had never noticed until that moment. "He's scared." The boy looked at his father, and in that gaze was something Edward had never seen before. There was recognition. There was a silent plea. There was awareness. "With all due respect, Mr. Alistair, you're not a doctor," Patricia maintained her professional tone. But there was a tension in her voice. "I know what's best for Michael's treatment. He needs to stick to his routine. Interruptions like this," she glanced at Helen with disdain, "can cause serious setbacks." Helen took a step forward, and Edward noticed she was trembling slightly, but held herself erect. "Excuse me, doctor, but I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just talking to Michael. He was responding very well." "Responding?" Patricia let out a humorless laugh. Michael has a severe developmental disorder. He doesn't respond, he mimics sounds, it's completely different. But I heard him, Edward said, his voice firmer. Now, I heard my son say words, clear words. The silence that followed was heavy. Patricia looked from Edward to Helen and back to Edward. Then she forced a professional smile, but there was something dangerous glittering in her eyes. Mr. Alistair, you've been away a great deal. It's natural that small developments would seem miraculous to you. Michael has shown some minimal progress, it's true, but nothing that changes the overall picture. The prognosis remains limited. That's why it's so important to stick to the protocol. She began to prepare the syringe again. Edward looked at Michael. The boy was staring at the syringe with wide eyes, his whole body tense. He started to shake his head from side to side, a small but desperate movement. No, Edward said again, this time with more force. Not today. No medication today. Mr. Alistair, I really must insist. I said no. Edward's voice echoed through the room. Patricia froze, the syringe still in her hand. It was the first time in 3 years he had openly contradicted any medical decision regarding his son. He had always trusted the experts, always believed they knew better than he did, but now, looking at the fear in Michael's eyes, all that blind trust shattered like glass. Patricia slowly put the syringe away, her lips pressed into a thin line. I see. Her voice was icy. I will note this in his report, but I must warn you that you are compromising his treatment. If there are setbacks, the responsibility will be yours. She left the room with stiff steps, leaving a trail of tension in the air. Edward stood there, trying to process what had just happened. He felt a light hand on his arm. Helen was beside him, her dark eyes full of concern. Mr. Alistair, I'm so sorry if I caused any trouble. I didn't mean to interfere. Edward looked at her, really looked, perhaps for the first time. She must have been in her late 20s, maybe 30 at most. Her face was delicate, but there was a strength there, something resilient in her features. Her eyes had that quality of someone who had seen a lot but still chose to see the good. You didn't cause any trouble, he said, his voice softer now. You did something I should have done a long time ago. You paid attention to my son. Helen smiled shyly and looked at Michael, who was still sitting on the carpet watching the two adults with that unusual focus. Edward felt his heart ache again. How many times had he been in this house, in this room, and never truly looked at his son this way? He misses you, Mr. Alistair, Helen said quietly, almost as if talking to herself. But I think Michael always knew that. I think he was always waiting for you to come back. The words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He knelt slowly beside his son. Michael didn't look away this time. He didn't flinch. He just stayed there, waiting, those enormous eyes fixed on his father's face. Hey, champ, Edward said, and his voice broke. He cleared his throat, trying again. Sorry it took me so long. Michael didn't answer, but he kept looking. And in that look, Edward saw everything he had lost. He saw the years he'd spent adding zeros to his bank account while his son grew up without him. He saw the nights he'd slept in 5-star hotels on the other side of the world, while Michael woke up alone in this enormous house. He saw all the choices he'd made, believing he was doing what was best, when in reality he was just running away. He reached out his hand, slowly, giving Michael time to pull away if he wanted. But the boy didn't move. Hesitantly, the small hand touched Edward's fingers. It was a light, almost imperceptible touch, but it was enough to make the tears Edward had been holding back finally roll down his face. Helen moved away discreetly, giving them space for the moment. Edward didn't even notice when she left the room. All that existed in that instant was him and Michael, and that fragile, precious connection being rebuilt, one block at a time. Out in the hallway, Helen leaned against the wall and let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking. She knew she had stepped into dangerous territory. She knew Dr. Andrews wouldn't forget this. But when she had looked into Michael's eyes for the first time, 2 weeks ago when she'd started working in this house, she had seen something no one else seemed to see. She had seen a child asking for help. Helen wasn't a therapist. She had no university degree or technical medical knowledge. She was just a young woman who had grown up taking care of 3 younger siblings while her mother worked 2 jobs to support the family. A young woman who had learned early on that caring for someone wasn't a matter of technique but of attention, of presence, of love. In her first few days cleaning the mansion, she had observed from a distance. She had seen the therapy sessions through ajar doors. She had seen how apathetic Michael became after taking his medication, how he seemed absent, lost within himself. But she had also seen the moments between sessions when Michael was alone in his room, and there was a vividness there that vanished as soon as Dr. Andrews arrived. Helen had started slowly. A good morning as she passed in the hall. A smile. Then one day she dared to sit near him while cleaning his room, and she started talking. Just talking. About the day, the weather, the birds she saw out the window. She didn't expect a response. She just talked, as if Michael could understand every word. And then one morning, Michael had looked at her. Really. Looked. And Helen had known in that instant that there was far more going on inside that child than anyone in that house imagined. The sound of high heels on the marble floor brought Helen back to the present. She looked down the corridor and saw Dr. Andrews hurrying down the stairs, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, but Helen managed to catch fragments. "Yes, Mother. He came back early. Yes, she's interfering. We need to act fast." Helen felt a chill run down her spine. There was something very wrong here. Something that went beyond a therapist annoyed by interference. There was fear in Patricia's voice and urgency. She went downstairs slowly, keeping her distance, and saw Patricia exit through the front door, still on the phone. Through the window, Helen watched a black car pull up to the entrance. A woman got out. She was older, elegant, with perfectly coiffed grey hair and expensive clothes. She approached Patricia, and the two spoke intensely for a few minutes. The older woman gestured firmly, clearly giving instructions. Helen went back to the kitchen, trying to look busy. Her heart was pounding. She didn't know what was happening, but all her instincts screamed that Michael was in danger. Not physical danger, perhaps, but something equally serious. When she returned to the second floor an hour later, the door to Michael's room was closed. Helen hesitated, then knocked softly. Edward opened it. His eyes were red, but there was a determination on his face that hadn't been there before. "Helen," he said, and for the first time, he used her name. "I need to talk to you. I need to know everything you've observed about Michael's treatment, everything you thought was strange, everything." Helen looked at him, then at Michael, who was lying in bed, finally relaxed, his eyes growing heavy with natural sleep. She nodded slowly. "There's a lot, Mr. Allister, a lot that I didn't understand." "Then tell me." Edward pulled up a chair and sat down, as if he were about to listen to the most important presentation of his life. "And you can call me Edward. I think after today, formalities don't make sense anymore." Helen sat down too, her hands clasped in her lap. She took a deep breath and began to speak. She spoke about the medication doses that seemed to increase, for no apparent reason. About how Michael always seemed to be progressing on the days Patricia wasn't there, only to regress when she returned. About the conversations she'd overheard between Patricia and that older woman, always in low tones, always full of urgency. About the medical reports she'd seen once by chance when Patricia had left her briefcase open in the kitchen. 2 different reports. One showed real progress. The other, which seemed to be the official one, showed complete stagnation. Edward listened to every word as if his life depended on it, and perhaps it did. Or at least Michael's life did. When Helen finished, silence filled the room. Outside, the London sky began to darken, the city lights coming on one by one, transforming the urban landscape into a sea of glittering dots. Inside that room, however, something was being born. A determination. A silent promise. Edward looked at his sleeping son, then at Helen, this young woman who had swept into his life like a gentle hurricane and turned everything upside down. "Thank you," he said simply. And then, with a firmness that came from somewhere deep inside, I'm going to find out what's happening. I promise. Helen nodded. There were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling, because for the first time since she had entered that house, she felt that someone was finally seeing, someone was finally paying attention, someone was finally willing to fight for that little boy. And in the silence of that room, as night fell over the city, a new story began. A story of truth, a story of discoveries that would change everything. A story that they didn't yet know would reveal secrets far darker than any of them could imagine. But for now, in that moment suspended, between day and night, Edward just held Michael's hand carefully and whispered a promise that would echo through all the following chapters of their lives. I'm going to protect you, champ. No matter from what, no matter from whom. I promise. The morning arrived with that characteristic London light, filtered through the light mist that always hung over the city in the early hours. Edward hadn't slept. He had spent the entire night in the mansion's study, surrounded by papers, medical contracts, and reports he had previously signed without question. With every page he read, every document he analyzed, more. Questions emerged in his mind like persistent ghosts. Helen knocked softly on the door at 7 in the morning, carrying a tray with coffee. She found Edward still in the same clothes as the day before, his reddened eyes fixed on the computer screen. You need to rest, she said gently, placing the steaming cup on the desk. You won't be any help to Michael if you get sick. Edward looked at her as if just realizing he wasn't alone. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble scratch his palm. Something is wrong, Helen, very wrong. Pointed to the stack of documents. These reports that Dr. Andrews gave me every month. I never really read them, I just signed where she asked. I trusted her. And now? Now I've read them. Edward picked up 2 different sheets. Look at this. This is the official report from March. It says Michael showed no significant improvement, recommends increasing his medication. But this one, he held up another sheet, is a draft that was stapled to the back. It talks about motor skill progress, attempts at vocalization, improved eye contact. Helen moved closer, reading over his shoulder. Why would she hide his progress? That's the question that's keeping me awake. Edward stood up, starting to pace. What reason would a therapist have to lie about her own patient's improvement? It makes no sense. Unless... He stopped in the middle of the room, a terrible idea taking shape in his mind. Unless she doesn't want Michael to get better. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. They both knew how absurd that sentence sounded, and at the same time how much sense it made. Edward's phone vibrated on the desk. It was his office. He ignored it. Then it rang again. And again. On the 5th call he answered sharply. What is it? Edward, thank God. His partner's voice was tense on the other end. You need to get back here now. We have a situation with the Dubai project. The investors are threatening to pull out. You handle it. What? Edward, we're talking about 200 million... I said, handle it. Edward hung up and threw the phone onto the sofa. Then he looked at his own hands, surprised by the firmness in his voice. Helen watched him in silence. Sorry, he muttered. I shouldn't have yelled. You're scared, it's normal. I'm more than scared. Edward sat down heavily in the armchair. I'm terrified, because if you're right about these reports, if there really are 2 different documents, it means something much bigger is happening. It means there's a reason. The sound of an approaching car interrupted them. They both looked out the study window. It was a silver BMW. A woman got out with precise, elegant movements. It was the same one Helen had seen the day before, the older woman who had spoken with Patricia. That's her, Helen whispered. Dr. Andrews' mother. Edward frowned. How do you know? I heard her on the phone yesterday. She called the woman Mother. Before Edward could respond, the doorbell rang. The sound of voices came from downstairs. The housekeeper answered, and moments later, firm footsteps ascended the stairs. Patricia appeared at the study door without knocking, followed by the older woman. Mr. Alistair. Patricia's voice was professional, but there was an underlying tension. This is my mother, Dr. Vera Andrews. She is a psychiatrist and the director of the Hope Clinic, where we conduct Michael's more specialized follow-ups. Edward stood. Up slowly, his eyes moving from one woman to the other. Vera Andrews had an air of unquestionable authority, perfectly arranged grey hair, expensive but discreet clothing, an erect posture. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Alistair, what a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Her voice was velvety, trained to soothe. "Patricia told me about the little incident yesterday. I completely understand your concern. It's natural for a father to want to believe in miracles." "It wasn't a miracle," Edward said, keeping his voice calm. "It was an observation. My son was communicating." Vera exchanged a quick glance with Patricia before turning her attention back to Edward. "I understand, but you see, Mr. Alistair, Michael has a complex condition. Sometimes children like him exhibit what we call islands of ability. Isolated moments that may seem promising but don't represent real progress. Then why hide it from the reports?" Edward crossed his arms. "Why don't the official reports mention any progress, no matter how small?" The silence that followed was heavy. Vera kept smiling, but something in her eyes changed. "We don't hide anything, Mr. Alistair. We only document what is clinically relevant. We don't want to give false hope." "False hope," Edward repeated slowly. "Or real hope that you'd rather I not have." Vera took a step forward, and Helen, who had been quiet in a corner, felt the instinct to stand between her and Edward. There was something predatory in that movement. "Mr. Alistair, I think stress has been affecting your judgment. It's understandable. You work too much, you're always traveling. Guilt can make us see things that aren't there." She paused deliberately. "That's why I believe it would be best if Michael spent some time at the clinic. We have a specialized inpatient wing. We could observe him 24 hours a day, adjust his medication appropriately." "Admit him." Edward's voice was louder than he intended. "He's at home. He's safe." "Is he?" Vera glanced around the study. "Because from yesterday's conversation, I understood that you question his treatment. You question his medication. That is extremely dangerous, Mr. Alistair. Michael needs his medication. Without it, he could have severe episodes." "What episodes?" Edward took a step forward. "In 3 years, I've never seen my son have a single episode. The only thing I see is him being apathetic after every dose you give." "Him," Patricia intervened, her voice sharp. "Sir, you don't understand. You don't have a medical background. You can't just stop a treatment because a cleaner made a few layman's observations." Helen, who had remained silent until now, felt her blood boil. "With all due respect, Doctor, I didn't make layman's observations. I just talked to Michael, like one person talks to another." Vera turned to her, and the look she gave was icy. "And who are you exactly? What are your qualifications to opine on a complex medical case?" "I have no qualifications," Helen admitted, lifting her chin. "But I'm also not trying to sell expensive treatments. I don't gain anything by keeping Michael sick." The silence that fell over the study was absolute. Edward looked at Helen with surprise. Patricia turned pale. Vera, on the other hand, smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile. "That was a very serious accusation, miss." She spoke slowly, each word laden with threat. "I hope you have proof to back it up. Otherwise, that's slander." "It's not an accusation," Helen said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "It's a question. Why have you increased Michael's medication 5 times in the last 6 months? Why is his every attempt to interact considered agitation that needs to be sedated? Why do the reports that show progress never reach his father?" "You read confidential documents?" Patricia practically screamed. "That's an invasion of privacy. I'll sue you." "Enough." Edward's voice cut through the air like a blade. They all looked at him. "You will leave, now, and you will not come back until I authorize it." "Mr. Alistair," Vera tried, her tone still conciliatory but with an edge of steel, "this is a grave mistake. If you interrupt his treatment, I may be forced to report this to social services. A child with special needs requires proper care. Denying him that could be considered negligence." Edward felt his blood run cold. It was a veiled threat, to take Michael from him. He looked at the 2 women, saw the cold determination in Vera's eyes, the barely contained anger in Patricia's. He weighed his options. He knew they had connections, influence, documents they could use against him. But then he looked at Helen, saw the trembling courage in this young woman who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by defending him. And he made his decision. You can do whatever you want, but my son will not be admitted. He will not receive any more medication without me understanding exactly what it's for and why it's necessary. And you, he looked directly at Vera, are fired. Both of you. Patricia took a step forward, her eyes blazing with fury. You can't do that. We have a contract. Which can be terminated. Edward picked up his phone. I'm calling my lawyer right now. I'm going to have him review every clause of this contract. And in the meantime, you will leave my house. You will regret this, Vera said quietly, but with a conviction that made Helen tremble. You will regret this deeply, Mr. Alistair. The two women left the study with firm steps. Edward and Helen stood still, listening to their heels clicking down the stairs, the front door slamming shut, the sound of the BMW's engine starting, the sound of the car driving away. Then Edward collapsed into the chair, his hands shaking. My God, he whispered. What have I just done? Helen approached, placing a hesitant hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing. What if they follow? Through on their threat. What if they try to take Michael from me? They won't succeed, because you're not neglecting your son. You're protecting him. Edward looked at her, saw the certainty in her eyes, and wanted to believe. God, how he wanted to believe. But there was fear, too. Fear that he was making the biggest mistake of his life. Fear that maybe Vera was right, and he was just an absent father trying to compensate for years of neglect with an impulsive act. The sound of bare feet in the hallway made them turn. Michael was standing at the study door, his pajamas rumpled, his hair messy from sleep. He was looking at his father with those large, dark eyes. Edward's heart ached. Good morning, champ. Michael didn't answer. He just stood there, watching. Then, slowly, he began to walk toward Edward. Each step was hesitant, as if testing unfamiliar ground. Helen and Edward remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe. When Michael got close enough, he reached out and touched his father's face. It was a light, almost imperceptible touch, his small fingers against the stubble. Edward closed his eyes, feeling the burn of tears. Daddy, Michael said. It was just one word, a single word. But it was as if the entire world had reordered itself around it. Edward pulled his son into a hug, carefully, afraid of scaring him, but Michael didn't pull away. On the contrary, he rested his head on his father's chest, and for the first time in years Edward felt the real physical, emotional weight of being a father. Helen moved away discreetly, tears rolling down her face. She left the study and went downstairs, needing air, needing space to process everything that was happening. In the kitchen she found Mrs. Martha, the housekeeper, preparing breakfast. I heard the shouting upstairs, Mrs. Martha said without looking up, chopping fruit with precise movements. Are those two gone? They are. Thank God. The older woman stopped chopping and looked at Helen. You know, I've worked in this house for 4 years. I've seen that boy since he arrived here, just 2 years old. I always thought it was strange, such a lively, bright baby. And then suddenly, after those two started their treatment, it was as if a light had gone out. You never said anything. Mrs. Martha shrugged. Who was I going to tell? Mr. Alistair was never here, and when he was, all he wanted to know was if everything was running smoothly. I'm just the housekeeper. Nobody asks for my opinion. But you noticed. Of course I noticed. Mrs. Martha went back to chopping the fruit, but there were tears in her eyes too. Those women would arrive with their bags of medicine, their syringes. The boy would cry. Then he would stop crying. He would stop everything. He'd get that look, like he wasn't really here. Helen sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of it all crashing down, on her. Mrs. Martha, do you think they were doing it on purpose, keeping Michael sick? The housekeeper stopped what she was doing and looked directly at Helen. I think there are people in this world who make money from other people's illnesses, and the sicker the person gets, the more money they make. The two were silent for a moment, the sound of the knife chopping fruit filling the space. Then Helen had an idea. Mrs. Martha, do you know if they left anything here? Documents, medicine, anything? There's a cabinet in Michael's room, locked. Dr. Patricia always said it was sensitive medical material. Helen stood up. Where's the key? I don't know, but... Mrs. Martha gave a sly smile. I know Mr. Alistair has a master key somewhere in his study, for emergencies. 10 minutes later, Helen was back in Michael's room with the key ring in her hand. Edward was still there, sitting on the floor with his son in his lap, talking softly. He looked at Helen with curiosity as she approached the white cabinet in the corner of the room. Mrs. Martha told me about this, Helen explained, trying different keys. She said Dr. Patricia kept it locked. On the 5th try, the cabinet opened. What they saw inside made both their blood run cold. There were dozens of vials of medication, but they weren't labeled. There were no brand names, just handwritten alphanumeric codes. There were syringes, ampules, and a black leather briefcase filled with documents. Edward gently placed Michael on the bed and approached the cabinet. He picked up the briefcase and opened it. Inside were medical reports, but not about Michael. They were about other children. 5, 10, 15 different names, all with photos attached, all with the same kind of vague diagnosis, all receiving the same medication codes. This is an experiment, Edward whispered, his voice strangled. They're using children as guinea pigs. Helen picked up one of the vials, trying to understand the code. There was a small label stuck to the base, almost imperceptible. It read, Project Aurora, Phase 2, not approved for commercial use. My God, she whispered. Edward was already on his phone, dialing. We need help. We need someone who understands this, who can analyze these substances. He called an acquaintance, a prosecutor who had helped with legal matters for his company years ago. He quickly explained the situation. On the other end, the man was silent for a long moment. Edward, this is extremely serious. If what you're saying is true, we're talking about organized crime, illegal experiments on children. You need protection. Now. Protection? These people won't let you expose them like this. If there's money involved, and from what you've described, there's a lot of money, they will react. Edward looked at Michael, who was watching everything with those attentive eyes. Then he looked at Helen, who was holding a vial of an unknown substance with trembling hands. Then he looked out the window at the quiet Kensington street and realized that none of it was as safe as it seemed. What do I do? First, don't touch anything else. This is a crime scene. Second, I'm sending a team over right now, plainclothes officers. They'll stay at the house. Third, you don't leave, you don't let the boy leave, and you don't talk to anyone until I get there. Edward hung up, his heart pounding. Helen was looking at him with fear in her eyes. What did he say? That we're in the middle of something much bigger than we imagined. Over the next few hours, the house transformed. 2 men arrived who identified themselves as federal officers. They were polite but firm. They secured Michael's room, photographed every item in the cabinet, sealed each vial in evidence bags. Edward and Helen gave separate statements, telling everything they knew, everything they had observed. In the middle of the afternoon, the prosecutor arrived in person. He was a middle-aged man, his hair starting to grey, his eyes weary from seeing too many bad things in his life. He shook Edward's hand firmly. Charles Wright, Crown Prosecution Service. Edward, you did the right thing by calling. This, he pointed to the evidence boxes being removed from the room, could be the tip of a very large iceberg. What do you mean? Wright sat down, indicating for Edward to do the same. For the past 2 years, we've been investigating rumors about illegal experiments in private clinics, but we've never been able to get concrete proof. The families always denied it. The doctors had impeccable paperwork. But you, without knowing it, have given us our first real evidence. And now we dig deeper. We're going to investigate the Hope Clinic, Doctor, Vera Andrews, everyone involved. But I have to be honest with you, this will take time, and they know they've been discovered. They will try to protect themselves. Edward felt the weight of those words. Is my son in danger? I don't know, Wright said honestly. It depends on how big this scheme is. If it's just one corrupt clinic, probably not. But if there are international labs involved, big money. He didn't need to finish. Edward understood. He looked out the study window, saw one of the plainclothes officers talking to Mrs. Martha in the garden. He saw Helen, going up the stairs, probably to be with Michael. He saw his entire life being turned inside out, and he realized he didn't regret it, not one bit, because for the first time in years, he was fighting for something that truly mattered. He was being a father. Outside, the London afternoon continued its course. Cars drove by on the quiet street. Birds sang in the trees. Life went on, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside the Kensington mansion. But for Edward, Helen, and Michael, nothing would ever be the same again. They had crossed an invisible line. They had challenged powerful people. They had chosen truth over the comfort of ignorance, and there was no going back. The night brought answers and more questions. Edward was in his study when Wright returned, his face grim. "We've identified the vials. They're experimental substances. New generation sedatives that haven't been approved by the MHRA. They were developed by a Swiss laboratory. What are they for? Behavioral control. In theory, to treat extreme cases of aggression. But the side effects include severe apathy, loss of motor skills, cognitive impairment." Edward closed his eyes, feeling nauseous. "They were destroying my son. They were using your son and other children too." Wright placed a file on the desk. "We managed to track the other names you found. 5 children, all from wealthy families, all with absent parents, all being treated in private clinics. It's a pattern. It's a scheme," Wright sighed. "The clinics get money from the lab to test the drugs. The families pay a fortune for the treatments. Everyone wins, except the children." Edward felt rage burn in his chest. But there was something else. There was determination. "We're going to end this." Wright looked at him with respect. "Yes, we are. But it will take time. And it will hurt. Are you prepared?" Edward thought of Michael. He thought of all the other children. He thought of Helen, who had risked everything to do the right thing. Then he nodded. "I am." That night, as the city slept outside, Edward went to Michael's room. The boy was lying in bed, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Helen was sitting in a chair beside him, quietly reading a story. She smiled when she saw Edward. "He can't sleep. I think he senses the tension." Edward sat on the edge of the bed, He held his son's small hand. Michael looked at him, and in that gaze was trust. Trust that Edward wasn't sure he deserved, but that he was determined to honor. "It's going to be okay, champ," he whispered. "I promise." And in that promise, in that silent moment between father and son, a new story began. A story of struggle, a story of justice, a story that would change not only their lives, but the lives of many other children. The storm was just beginning. But for the first time, Edward wasn't running from it. He was standing his ground, ready to face it. The days that followed were like living in a thick fog. The Kensington mansion, once silent and empty, now pulsed with a different energy. There was always someone there. Plainclothes officers rotating shifts, lawyers coming and going with bulky briefcases. Prosecutor Wright came at least once a day, bringing updates or asking new questions. Edward cancelled all his international trips. He delegated important meetings. For the first time in 10 years, his company was not the priority. Michael was, and the more time he spent with his son, the more Edward realized how much he had missed. Every small bit of progress was a miracle. Every new word Michael managed to articulate was a victory. Helen had become a permanent part of the routine. Officially, she was still a cleaner, but in practice, she was so much more. She was the one who stayed with Michael during his daily activities. She was the one who could calm the boy down when he got anxious about all the strange activity in the house. She was the one who, in the early hours when Edward couldn't sleep, would sit with him in the kitchen and talk about hopes and fears. A week after the discovery in the cabinet, Wright arrived with grave news. Edward, Helen, and he gathered in the study, while Michael slept upstairs. "We've traced the money," Wright began. opening his laptop. The Hope Clinic receives monthly transfers from an account in Switzerland. The amount is substantial. We're talking about £500,000 a month. Edward's stomach churned. All that to test drugs on children. It's not just that. Wright showed documents on the screen. Dr. Vera Andrews is the majority shareholder of 3 private clinics in London, all specializing in children with special needs, all receiving the same kind of transfers. We estimate that in the last 5 years she has moved over £30 million. 30 million, Edward repeated, incredulous. How many children? We're still investigating. But just in the clinics we've been able to access, we've identified 23 suspicious cases. And that's just London. Helen covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Could there be more? Many more. Wright closed the laptop. We're in contact with authorities in other parts of the country. There are indications that this scheme extends to Manchester and Edinburgh. The silence that fell over the study was heavy. Edward stood up, needing to move, needing to do something with all the rage boiling inside him. How did no one notice? How could this go on for so long? Because the families don't question it. Wright was honest, as always. Think about it, Edward. You're a successful businessman. When Dr. Vera told you that Michael had a complex condition requiring expensive and intensive treatment, did you question her? Did you get a second opinion? Edward stopped pacing, the question hitting him like a punch. No, I trusted her, because she seemed competent, because the clinic had a good reputation, because you didn't want to believe anyone would be capable of doing this to children, Wright completed gently, and that's the point. These people exploit the hope of parents. They exploit their desperation. You'll pay any price to see your child get better. And when he doesn't, they say the condition is too severe, that you need more treatments, more medication. It's a vicious cycle, Helen said quietly. It's a business, Wright corrected bitterly. A billion-dollar business built on the suffering of children. Edward sat down again, his legs suddenly weak. So what do we do now? We keep investigating, but I need to warn you about something. Wright exchanged a look with Helen before turning his attention back to Edward. Dr. Vera isn't sitting back passively. She's hired one of the best law firms in the country. They're claiming it's all a misunderstanding, that the medications were experimental, yes, but with ethical approval, that the parents were informed. That's a lie, Edward exploded. They never told me anything about experiments. I know, but they have documents, contracts you signed, authorizations bearing your signature. I never signed anything authorizing experiments. Wright opened a folder and placed papers on the desk. Edward looked and felt the floor disappear from under his feet. They were detailed authorizations, with his signature, dated, witnessed. I didn't sign this, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Because looking at those papers, at that signature that was perfectly similar to his, doubt began to erode his certainty. How many documents had he signed over the years without reading them? How many contracts had he approved, trusting only the doctor's word? Helen came closer, picking up one of the papers. She looked at it carefully. Edward, is this your signature? Edward looked again. It's very similar, but I don't remember signing it. Look at the date, Helen pointed. August 3rd, 2022. Do you remember where you were on that day? Edward tried to think. August 2022. He took out his phone, checked his old calendar. I was in Dubai. I was there for 3 weeks closing a deal. Then you couldn't have signed this in London. Wright took the paper, examining it more closely. It could be a forgery. I'll send it for forensic analysis. If we can prove document forgery, we'll have another crime to add to the list. How? Many crimes do we have already? Formally, Wright began counting on his fingers. Illegal testing on human subjects, unlawful practice of medicine if the drugs weren't approved, forgery of official documents, money laundering with the international transfers. Depending on what else we find, we could add conspiracy, corruption if there's involvement from MHRA officials. And can they be convicted? If we have enough evidence, yes. But Edward, you need to understand that this will become public. It's going to be a massive scandal. The media will cover it. They'll talk about you, about Michael, about everything. Edward looked out the window. Outside, life went on as normal. Cars passed, pedestrians walked by. No one knew that inside this house, an entire world was being dismantled piece by piece. "I don't care," he said finally. "If exposing this saves other children, I don't care. It will be hard on Michael, too. I know. But continuing to hide it is worse." Helen placed a hand on his shoulder, a small but comforting gesture. Edward looked at her, saw the strength in her eyes, and wondered how a person he'd barely known for 2 weeks had become so essential to his life. The key meeting ended with Wright taking the documents for analysis. When he left, Edward and Helen were alone in the study. The silence between them was comfortable, not needing to be filled with words. "Are you okay?" Helen asked finally. "I don't know." Edward ran his hands over his face. "I keep thinking about all those other children, about how many parents are in the same boat I was, blindly trusting corrupt doctors. You couldn't have known. I should have known. I should have paid more attention. I should have been more present." Helen sat in the chair beside him. "Edward, can I tell you something?" "Of course, and please stop calling me Mr. Alistair. I'm just Edward." Helen smiled shyly. "Edward, then. You're doing the right thing now. That's what matters. You can't go back and change the past, but you can change the future." Wise for someone so young. "I'm not that young. I'm 28. Edward smiled. "You seem young." "It's the ponytail." Helen laughed, but the smile faded quickly. "Can I tell you something? Something I haven't told anyone yet?" "Of course. I didn't come to work here by chance." Helen looked down at her hands. "I sought out this job on purpose." Edward frowned. "What do you mean?" "My younger brother. He had autism. He was treated at one of those private clinics." Her voice began to falter. "He was progressing well, you know. He was starting to communicate, to interact. And then, suddenly, he started to regress. He became apathetic, distant. The doctors said it was normal, that it happened sometimes. My mum was devastated. They increased his medication." "What happened?" "He died. 2 years ago. He was only 12. Edward's heart ached. "Helen, I'm so sorry. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but I never believed it. He was healthy. He had no heart problems." She wiped away her tears. "I started researching. I found out he was being treated at the Hope Clinic by Dr. Vera Andrews. I saw the same patterns, the regression, the increasing medication, the contradictory reports. That's why you came to work here. I had to know. I had to understand what they did to my brother. When I saw the agency's ad looking for someone to work in the home of a businessman whose son was treated by the same doctor, I knew I had to come." Edward looked at her with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. "You've been investigating this on your own?" "I was, until you showed up." Helen smiled through her tears. "I thought I would just gather evidence and turn it over to the police anonymously. I never imagined Michael's father would actually care. A lot of parents don't want to believe. It's easier to trust the doctors. I was almost one of those parents, but you weren't, and that makes all the difference." They were silent for a moment. Then Edward asked, "Are you doing this for your brother?" "I'm doing this for all the children, for my brother, for Michael, for all the ones in clinics right now being used as guinea pigs." "You're incredible," Edward said, "and it wasn't just kindness, it was the truth. You are one of the bravest people I have ever met." Helen looked away, blushing. "I'm just doing what's right. Most people don't even do that." Before Helen could answer, the sound of shattering glass came from somewhere in the house. They both jumped to their feet. Edward ran into the hall, Helen right behind him. Mrs. Martha appeared on the stairs, her face pale. "It's in Michael's room." Edward took the steps 3 at a time, his heart racing. The bedroom door was closed. He forced it open and found one of the plainclothes officers checking the window. The glass was broken. A rock lay in the middle of the room. "What happened?" "Someone threw this." The officer showed him the rock. "There's a message." Tied to the rock was a piece of paper. Edward unrolled it with trembling hands. The message was short and direct, written in block letters. "Stop now or you'll regret it." Helen reached the doorway, breathless. She saw the paper in Edward's hand and turned pale. "Edward, where's Michael?" "He's sleeping in his own room," the officer pointed. This was the playroom. "Thank God we moved him last night." Edward felt his legs go weak. If Michael had still been sleeping in here, the rock could have hit him. He grabbed his phone, urgently calling Wright. "They just threw a rock through a window here, with a threat. I'm on my way." Wright hung up before Edward could reply. 15 minutes later, the house was full of real police officers, no longer the discreet plainclothes ones. Wright arrived with an investigation team. They collected the rock, the paper, took photos of the broken glass. "This changes everything," Wright said grimly. "A direct threat. I'm requesting official protection for you and Michael. 24-hour guards." "They're desperate," Helen said. "They must know we're close to something big." "We are." Wright looked at Edward. "That's why they're reacting. I got a court order this morning. We're searching the Hope Clinic tomorrow morning. If there's more evidence there, we'll find it." Edward nodded, but he was shaking. The reality of the danger was finally hitting him in a visceral way. These people weren't just corrupt. They were dangerous. That night, no one slept well. Edward stayed awake in Michael's room, listening to his son's light breathing, thinking of all the ways this could end badly. Helen slept in the room next door, but Edward could hear her tossing and turning, also restless. Around 3 in the morning, Edward went down to the kitchen for water. He found Helen already there, making tea. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "I can't turn my mind off." Helen poured a cup for him too. They sat at the kitchen table, the house silent around them, only the sound of the officers on patrol outside. "Are you scared?" Edward asked. "I am, but not for myself. I'm scared we won't be able to stop this in time, that other children will suffer while the investigation drags on." Wright seems confident. "Prosecutors always seem confident." Helen took a sip of tea. "But justice is slow, and these women have money, connections. So what do? We keep fighting. We keep exposing them. We keep taking care of Michael and proving that children like him can progress when they're treated with dignity." Edward looked at her through the steam from his tea. "How can you be so strong?" "I'm not strong, I'm just stubborn." Helen smiled. "My mum always said I was too stubborn for my own good." "Is your mother still alive?" "She is. Lives in Croydon with my other siblings. She doesn't know I'm doing this. She thinks I'm just working as a cleaner." "Are you going to tell her?" "When it's all over, maybe. For now, I'd rather keep her out of it. She's already lost one son. I don't want her worrying about me, too." They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Edward said, "After this is over, after they're convicted and Michael is safe, I'd like to hire you officially. As a cleaner, as a tutor, or a therapist, or whatever title you want. You're good with him. Better than any professional with a degree that I've ever hired." Helen smiled but shook her head. "I don't know if I'm qualified for that." "You're more qualified than anyone, because you see Michael as a person, not as a diagnosis, not as a project, as a person." The words hung in the air between them. Helen looked at Edward, and for the first time since they'd met, she truly allowed herself to see the man in front of her. Not the wealthy businessman, not the absent father, but the man who was fighting to right his wrongs, the man who chose to believe when it would have been easier to doubt, the man who was risking everything to protect his son. "Thank you," she said softly, "for trusting me." "Thank you," Edward replied, "for not giving up when it would have been safer to do so." The dawn came slowly, painting the London sky in shades of pink and orange. Edward and Helen were still in the kitchen, talking about everything and nothing, about dreams and fears, about the past and the future, about the lives they had before their paths crossed in that Kensington mansion. When the sun finally appeared on the horizon, Wright arrived. He had a large team with him, bulletproof vests, grim faces. "Today's the day," he said simply. Are you ready for what might happen? Edward looked at Helen. She nodded. He nodded too. We are. The operation at the Hope Clinic began at 7 in the morning. Edward didn't go, but Wright stayed in constant contact, sending text updates. We're in the clinic. Dr. Vera is here being questioned. Found a safe, trying to open it. We're in. There are documents, lots of documents. We've found an entire floor of children. My God, Edward, there are at least 20. The last message made Edward sit down. 20 children. 20 little lives being destroyed at that very moment. 20 families deceived. Helen saw his expression and came over. What is it? They found more children, 20 of them. Her eyes filled with tears. We're going to save them. We're going to save all of them. Edward, they wanted to believe. God, how he wanted to believe. But he was afraid. Afraid that even after exposing everything, even after arresting those responsible, the damage was already done. Afraid that for some of those children, it was already too late. The phone rang. It was Wright. Edward, I need you to come down here. Now. Why? Because you're not going to believe what we've found. Edward went with 2 police officers. He left Helen to look after Michael, who had woken up and was having a good day, communicative and alert. The Hope Clinic was located in Mayfair, a modern and elegant building that betrayed none of the horrors that occurred inside. When Edward entered, accompanied by Wright, he was taken to a room in the basement. It was a luxurious office, but there was something sinister about it. On the walls, files. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of files, each with a photo of a child. These are the cases, Wright explained, not just from London, from all over the UK. We've identified cases from 7 different regions. How many? Wright hesitated. We're still counting, but it's over 200. 200. Edward felt the room spin. 200 children. And there's more. Wright opened a file on the computer. We found emails, correspondence with labs in Switzerland, Germany, the United States. They weren't just testing one drug. There were several, dozens of different substances. This is genocide. It's a crime against humanity. Wright closed the file. We're involving the National Crime Agency. This is bigger than any of us. Edward looked at the photos on the walls. Each one a face, each face a story, each story a tragedy. And among all those photos he saw a familiar one. That's Helen's brother. He pointed to a photo of a boy with large eyes and a shy smile. Wright checked the file. Raphael Sterling, 12 years old, cause of death, cardiac arrest. He looked at Edward. Did she know? She suspected. That's why she came to work at my house. She told you? Yesterday. Wright nodded slowly. She's going to want to see this. It will destroy her. It will, but it will also give her justice. Edward took a photo from Raphael's file. Then he looked around the room, at all the evidence of systematic horror, and made a decision. I want to expose everything. I want the entire country to know what these people did. Edward, I have to warn you. This will turn into a media circus. They'll investigate your life too. They'll question why you didn't notice sooner. I don't care. This needs to end. Now. Wright placed a hand on Edward's shoulder. You're a brave man. No. Edward looked at the photo of Raphael he was holding. I'm just doing what I should have done years ago. What all of these parents should be doing. While Edward was at the clinic, Helen was playing with Michael in the mansion's garden. The boy was excited, showing her the flowers, naming the colours. It was a beautiful day, one of those rare days in London when the sky was clear and blue. But Helen couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen, something that would change everything. When Edward returned late that night, he was different, older, more tired, but also more determined. Helen saw in his eyes that he had seen things he could not unsee. What happened? She asked when they were alone. Edward hesitated. Then he took the photo of Raphael from his pocket and handed it to her. Helen looked. The tears came instantly. He was there, one of their cases. Helen covered her mouth with her hand, sobbing. Edward pulled her into a hug. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a human one, of comfort, of shared pain. "We're going to get justice for him," Edward whispered. "For him and for all the other children, I promise." And in that hug, in that promise, something changed between them. It was no longer just about Michael. It was no longer just about revenge or justice. It became about not letting anyone else suffer what they had suffered. It became about turning pain into purpose. It became about choosing to fight, even when it would have been easier to give up. Night fell over London, but inside the Kensington mansion, for the first time in a long time, there was light. The light of hope. The light of determination. The light of people who had decided that tomorrow would be different. No matter the cost, the 3 months that followed were like an earthquake that never stopped having aftershocks. The news of the Hope Clinic scheme exploded in every newspaper in the country. It was everywhere, on television, on news, websites, in pub conversations. The entire UK was shocked by the scale of the cruelty, the cynicism of those involved, the number of children who had been used as guinea pigs. Edward woke up every day to dozens of notifications, interview requests, messages of support, messages of hate from those who thought he was responsible for not noticing sooner. He read everything. He let the words hit him, because on some level he felt he deserved it. He deserved to carry some of the pain that had been inflicted on so many families. But when he looked at Michael, when he saw his son progressing day after day, managing to form complete sentences, asking questions, laughing, truly living, he remembered why it was all worth it. Dr. Vera Andrews and her daughter Patricia were held on remand. Their defense tried to argue they were just professionals following approved research protocols, but the evidence was overwhelming. Forged documents, altered reports, explicit emails detailing the scheme, bank transfers that traced a clear trail of money from international laboratories. The Crown Prosecution Service took over the case. Other doctors were indicted. MHRA officials who had taken bribes to look the other way were suspended. It was a complete dismantling of a network that had operated in the shadows for years. But for Edward, the most important part wasn't happening in the courts. It was happening at home. Michael had woken up that October morning, humming a song Helen had taught him. Edward heard him from the hallway and stood still, just listening, letting that sound fill the empty spaces in his soul. Then he entered the room. "Good morning, champ." Michael looked at him and smiled, that wide, genuine smile that Edward never thought he would see. "Good morning, Dad." Dad. Not Daddy. Dad. Michael was growing up. He was developing. He was becoming who he was always meant to be. Helen appeared at the door with a breakfast tray. In recent months, she had become much more than an employee. She was family, not on paper, not yet, but in every way that truly mattered. She knew Michael's fears. She knew when he needed space and when he needed company. She understood Edward in ways he didn't understand himself. And Edward, in turn, had learned to see her, not as the young woman who had saved him, not as the heroine of the story, but as Helen, human, vulnerable, strong, complex, beautiful in her imperfections. They had never spoken openly about the feelings growing between them. It seemed inappropriate, in the midst of everything, in the midst of investigations and hearings and interviews, but it was there, in the way Edward's eyes searched for Helen when he entered a room, in the way she blushed when their fingers touched as they passed a plate, in the way they talked late into the night about dreams that had once seemed impossible. "Today's the day," Helen said, placing the tray on the small table. "Are you ready?" "I think so." Edward took a deep breath. "And you?" "I'll be there, always." Today was the day of the first public hearing. The prosecution had organized an event where victims' families could testify. They could tell their stories, give faces and names to the cold statistics. Edward had been invited to speak. He was afraid he wouldn't find the right words, afraid he would break down in the middle of his speech. But he knew he had to do it, for the children, for Michael, for Raphael, for everyone. The courtroom at the Old Bailey was packed. There were families, journalists, lawyers, onlookers. Edward entered with Helen and Michael. They had debated whether it was appropriate to bring the boy, but Michael had insisted. "I want to go," he had said, his voice still struggling with some syllables but clearer every day. "I want to see." "See what, champ?" Edward had asked. "See the bad people go away." The innocence of that sentence had broken Edward's heart, but it had also strengthened him. Michael deserved to see justice being done. He deserved to know that the world, for all its flaws, still had room for right to overcome wrong. When it was Edward's turn to speak, he walked to the witness box with trembling hands. He looked at the gallery. He saw so many faces, some familiar from news reports, many unknown, all united by the same pain, the same anger, the same need for justice. He began to speak. His voice was uncertain at first, but it gained strength as the words flowed. "My name is Edward Alastair. I am Michael's father, and for 3 years I trusted the wrong people with my son's life." He told them everything, from the initial diagnosis to the discovery of the cabinet of medications. He spoke of his absence, of how building an empire meant nothing if he couldn't protect the one person who truly mattered. He spoke of Helen, of her courage in risking everything to expose the truth. He spoke of the system that allowed people to use vulnerable children to get rich. His voice broke when he mentioned the other children, the 200+ lives that had been destroyed or compromised, the families who would never know the truth because their children were no longer here to bear witness. When he finished, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then someone started to clap, then another and another. Within seconds, everyone was on their feet applauding. It wasn't an ovation. It was recognition. It was gratitude. It was a collective affirmation that the truth, however painful, needed to be spoken. Edward stepped down, tears streaming freely down his face. Helen was waiting for him with Michael. The boy hugged him tightly, and in that embrace, Edward felt all the pieces of his life finally fall into the right place. In the months that followed, the legal process moved forward. Vera and Patricia were formally charged with multiple crimes. Other doctors, too. The Swiss laboratory faced international investigations. It wouldn't be quick. Justice never was. But it was happening. And in the meantime, Edward began to build something new. The idea came one night, during one of those late-night conversations with Helen. "What if we used all of this to create something good?" he had said. "Something to help other families, to educate people about neurodiversity, to show that children like Michael aren't failed projects, they're just children who need different approaches." Helen had looked at him with those bright eyes. A foundation. A foundation. A center. A place where families can find real information, real treatment, real support. And so the Raphael Michael Institute was born. The name was a tribute to Helen's brother who couldn't be saved, to Edward's son who could, to all the children who deserve to have their names remembered, not as victims but as people full of potential. Edward used a significant portion of his fortune to fund the project. He bought a large building in Notting Hill. He hired the best professionals, but not doctors who believed in rigid protocols and medication as a first response. He sought out professionals who understood that every child was unique. That treatment wasn't about normalization, but about allowing each person to flourish in their own way. Helen became the educational director. She didn't have a university degree, but she had something more valuable. She had empathy. She had lived experience. She had the perspective of someone who understood firsthand what it meant to be treated as less than human. Together, they created a space that was everything the Hope Clinic pretended to be but never was. A place of real welcome, of real listening, of real care. The institute grew faster than anyone expected. Families from all over the country began to seek them out. The media coverage was positive. Other celebrities and business leaders offered financial support. Within 6 months, they had a waiting list of hundreds of families. But it wasn't about numbers. It was about each child, each family, each individual story of overcoming. 1 year after the initial discovery of the scheme, the Raphael Michael Institute held its first public event, a showcase where the children served by the institute would show the world what they were capable of when treated with dignity and respect. Edward was Backstage, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. He was nervous, not for himself, for Michael. The boy had insisted on participating. He wanted to speak. He wanted to tell his story. "Are you sure about this, champ?" Edward had asked the night before. "You don't have to do it if you don't want to." But Michael had looked at him with that determination Edward had learned to recognize. "I want to. I want people to know." Helen appeared beside Edward, beautiful in a simple blue dress. She rarely wore dresses, preferring practical clothes for working with the children, but today was special. "He's ready," she said, pointing to Michael waiting on the other side of the stage. "And you?" Edward asked, taking her hand. "Are you ready?" Helen intertwined her fingers with his, a gesture that had become natural over the months, a touch that said more than words ever could. "I am. We are." The showcase began. Several children took the stage, each demonstrating skills they had once been told were impossible. A girl painted a beautiful picture while talking about how art helped her process emotions. A boy played the piano, each note perfect, his unique way of communicating with the world. Another child recited a poem she had written herself, powerful words about being different in a world that demands conformity. And then it was Michael's turn. He walked onto the stage with that determined gait. He was 7 now, still small but growing. He still had challenges, he always would, but they were his challenges to navigate, not barriers imposed by others. The auditorium fell completely silent. Michael looked at the audience. He saw his father, he saw Helen, he saw Mrs. Martha in the front row crying with pride. He saw so many unfamiliar faces, but they were all looking at him with expectation and warmth. And then he began to speak. "My name is Michael. I'm 7 years old. I was once told I would never talk, that I would never learn, that I would never be like other children." He paused. Edward held his breath. "They were wrong." The audience erupted in applause. Michael waited for them to quiet down before continuing. "I'm not like other children. I'm like me, and that's good." He smiled. "My dad learned that. Helen always knew it. Now I know it too." Each word was carefully articulated. Some syllables were still difficult, but the message was crystal clear. It was powerful. It was true. When Michael finished his short speech, when he came down from the stage and ran into his father's arms, there wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. Edward held him tight, feeling the perfect weight of that small body against his chest, feeling life pulsing in that hug. Helen joined them, and the three of them stood there, embracing, as the auditorium gave them a standing ovation. It wasn't just a celebration, it was an affirmation. It was proof that change was possible, that justice was possible, that genuine love and care could reverse even the deepest damage. That night, after the event ended, after everyone had gone home and the institute grew quiet, Edward, Helen, and Michael stood in the institution's garden. It was a beautiful garden that Helen had helped design, full of colorful plants and spaces for the children to explore. The moon was full, bathing everything in silvery light. Michael was tired, lying on a bench with his head in Helen's lap, almost asleep. Edward sat beside them, looking up at the starry London sky, so rarely, visible through the light pollution. "We did it," he said quietly. "Did what?" Helen asked, gently running her fingers through Michael's hair. "Turned something awful into something good." Helen looked at him. "The three of us did it. Together." "Together," Edward repeated, and there was something in the way he said the word, something laden with meaning, with promise, with future. Helen blushed, but didn't look away. Their eyes met over the head of the sleeping Michael. It wasn't the time for grand declarations. It wasn't the time for promises of eternal love. It was simply the time to acknowledge what had grown between them over the months. Respect, admiration, partnership, and yes, love. A love born from shared suffering and nurtured in the joint struggle for something bigger than themselves. Edward reached out his hand. Helen took it. And in that simple touch, in that silent moment under the stars, with Michael sleeping peacefully between them, the future took shape. Not a perfect future. There would be challenges. There would be difficult days. There would be moments of doubt. But it would be a future built on a solid foundation. Truth, trust, genuine love. The following months brought more changes. The sentences started coming down. Vera Andrews was sentenced to 15 years in prison for multiple crimes. Patricia received 12 years. Other doctors and staff were also convicted. The Swiss laboratory had to pay millions in compensation to the victims' families. It wasn't enough. It never would be. But it was a start. The Raphael Michael Institute continued to grow. They opened branches in other cities, Manchester, Edinburgh, Birmingham, each following the same model of respectful, child-centered care. Edward delegated almost all of the management of his companies to focus on the Institute. He discovered that building something that truly mattered was far more rewarding than accumulating zeros in a bank account. Helen discovered a passion for teaching. She started giving lectures at universities, speaking about the importance of listening to families, of seeing beyond diagnoses, of treating each person as unique. Her story, Raphael's story, became a call for change in how society views and treats neurodivergent people. And Michael continued to flourish. He started at a specialized school that the Institute helped found. He made friends. He learned to read. He discovered a love for drawing and spent hours creating imaginary worlds on paper. He still had his challenges. Some days were harder than others, but they were the normal challenges of a normal child, growing up in a world that was finally learning to accommodate him. 2 years after that first night when Edward came home and heard his son speak, he and Helen were in the Institute's garden again. It was late afternoon. Michael was playing with other children nearby, their laughter echoing in the warm air. Edward looked at Helen. Over the past 2 years, she had become absolutely essential to his life. She was his partner at the Institute. She was the mother figure Michael had never had. She was his best friend. She was the person with whom he shared every success and every failure. She was the person he loved. "Helen," he said, his heart beating fast. She looked at him, her eyes curious. "Yes." Edward took a deep breath. He had rehearsed this 1,000 times in his head. He had planned the perfect moment. But now, looking at her there, with the setting sun painting her hair gold, with the sound of happy children in the background, he realized he didn't need a plan, he just needed honesty. "I love you." The words came out simply, directly, truthfully. Helen blinked, surprised. Then a slow smile spread across her face, a smile that lit up the entire garden. "I love you too." It wasn't a marriage proposal, not yet. It was simply the affirmation of something they both already knew but needed to be said aloud. It was the courage to name the feeling that had grown day by day, brick by brick, until it had become something solid and unshakable. Michael came running up, interrupting the moment, asking his dad to look at a drawing he had just made. Edward picked the boy up, looked at the drawing and saw 3 figures: a tall man, a woman with long hair, a small boy, all holding hands. "It's us," Michael explained with pride. "Our family." "Our family," Edward repeated, looking at Helen over his son's head. And he saw in her eyes the same recognition. Yes, they were a family now, not by blood, but by something stronger, by choice, by love, by everything they had been through together. The years passed. The Institute continued its work. Thousands of children were helped. Many families found hope where there had once been only despair. Public policies began to change, influenced by the Institute's work. Schools became more inclusive. Society slowly began to understand that different does not mean less. Edward and Helen married in a small, intimate ceremony, just close family and dear friends. Michael was the page boy carrying the rings with adorable seriousness. Mrs. Martha cried her eyes out. Prosecutor Wright was there, now a long-time friend. It was a moment of celebration, but also of reflection, of gratitude for all they had survived, for all they had built. Michael grew up. He became a teenager, then a young adult. He always had his challenges, but he learned to navigate them with grace and determination. He discovered a passion for music and began composing. His songs spoke of being different, of finding beauty in one's own quirks, of the love that transforms and heals. When Michael turned 18, the Institute organized a gala for its 10th anniversary. 10 years since its founding, 10 years of transforming lives, 10 years of proving that another way of caring was possible. Edward took the stage to speak. He was in his early 50s now, hair starting to grey, expression lines that weren't there before. But there was a lightness to him that had never existed in his days as a young, success-obsessed entrepreneur. "When I began this journey," he said to the packed audience, "I was lost. I had built an empire, but I was failing at the one thing that truly mattered. Being a father, being present, being human." He looked at Helen, sitting in the front row beside Michael. "It took a brave young woman to show me that success isn't measured in money or power. It's measured in lives touched, in love shared, in real change in the world." The audience applauded. Edward waited for the silence. 10 years ago, I discovered that the people who had sworn to help my son were actually destroying him. I discovered a horrific scheme that victimized hundreds of children. It was devastating. It was infuriating. It was the darkest moment of my life." He paused, the emotion clear in his voice. "But from that darkness, light was born. This institute was born. A family was born. The understanding that even in the worst circumstances, there is always a choice. We can choose bitterness or action. We can choose revenge or transformation. We can choose to close our hearts or open them even wider for the light to come in." Michael stood up in the audience, now a young man of 18, tall, with his father's intelligent eyes and Helen's gentle smile. He walked onto the stage, uninvited. Edward looked at him with surprise and pride. "Dad, can I say something?" Edward nodded, stepping away from the microphone. Michael turned to the audience. His diction still had slight quirks, but it was clear, confident. "When I was 6, there were people who wanted to keep me sick. They wanted to keep me quiet. They wanted to use me." He looked at his father. "My dad saved me, but more than that, he learned. He learned that saving me wasn't about fixing me. It was about loving me as I am." Tears were now streaming freely down Edward's face. "And because of that," Michael continued, "hundreds of other children were saved too. Hundreds of families found hope. This institute isn't just a place. It's proof that love transforms, that courage inspires, that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, is always worth it." Michael hugged his father. The audience rose in a deafening, standing ovation. Helen came onto the stage too, joining the hug. And there, under the bright lights before hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by their work, the three of them stood, united, complete. A family forged, not in perfection, but in overcoming. Not in the absence of pain, but in the choice to transform it into something good. That night, after everyone had left, Edward, Helen, and Michael stood in the Institute's garden. It was the same garden where, years ago, Edward had confessed his love for Helen. The same stars shone in the sky, but everything was different now, not because they were different people, but because they had chosen day after day to be better. "You know you're the most important people in my life, right?" Edward said, looking at Helen and Michael. Helen smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We know." "We know," Michael echoed, smiling. "And you know that all of this," Edward gestured to the Institute, to the garden, to everything they had built, "was only possible because you two taught me what really matters." "You taught yourself," Helen said gently. "We just showed you the way." Edward looked up at the stars. He thought of all the children who had passed through the Institute's doors, all the families who had found hope, all the lives that had been changed, and he thought of Vera and Patricia serving their sentences, their lives ruined by greed and cruelty. He thought about how complex the world was, how good and evil were rarely absolute, but how it was always, always worth choosing to try to do good. The story could have ended in tragedy. Michael could have been just another statistic. Edward could have remained blind, focused on his corporate empire, missing what truly mattered. Helen could have given up her quest for justice for her brother. Any of them could have chosen the easier path. But they didn't. They chose truth, even when it hurt. They chose justice, even when it was dangerous. They chose love, even when it was frightening. And because of those choices, the world became a little better. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. And in the end, wasn't that what life was about? Making choices, trying to be better, turning pain into purpose, loving fiercely and without apology, building something that would last beyond ourselves. Edward looked at Michael, who was watching the stars with that unique intensity he always had. He looked at Helen, whose profile was illuminated by the full moon, and he felt gratitude, deep, visceral gratitude for having had the chance to start over, to right his wrongs, to learn what it truly meant to be a father, a partner, a human being. Their life wouldn't be easy from then on. There would still be challenges. There would still be difficult days. But they would face them together, as a family, as a team, as three people who had looked into the abyss of human cruelty and decided to respond with compassion. The night breeze brought the scent of the garden's flowers. In the distance, the city of London pulsed with life, millions of stories happening simultaneously, each unique, each important. And in that quiet garden, three of those stories intertwined, forming something greater than the sum of their parts. Edward took Helen's hand, Michael held his father's hand, and the three of them stood there, looking at the stars, united by something greater than pain. United by the courage to face the invisible, by the truth that could no longer be silenced, and by a love that had blossomed in the fertile ground of rebuilding. It wasn't an ending, it was a beginning of the rest of their lives, of the continuous work of making the world a better place, of the daily journey of choosing love over fear, hope over despair, action over apathy. And in that choice, in that commitment renewed with each dawn, was the true victory. Not over others, but over the darkest parts of themselves. Not in the absence of hardship, but in the determination to face it together. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities. There would be joys and sorrows, successes and failures, moments of doubt and moments of absolute certainty. But through it all, they would have each other. They would have their shared purpose. They would have the love that sustained them on the darkest days, and celebrated with them on the brightest. Edward looked one last time at the stars, then he looked at Helen and Michael, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, not in a corporate office, not in a business meeting on the other side of the world, but here, in this garden, with these people, doing this work. It was everything he had ever wanted. He had just needed an earthquake to realize it. And now, rebuilt from the ruins of who he used to be, Edward was ready. Ready to keep fighting. Ready to keep loving. Ready to keep transforming darkness into light, one day at a time, one child at a time, one heart at a time. The moon shone down on them. The stars bore witness. And in the serene silence of that London night, three intertwined lives promised without words to continue the journey together, always together. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not wealth, not fame, not power, but the people we choose to love, the good we choose to do, the legacy we choose to leave. And their legacy would be one of transformation, of hope, of unconditional love, of justice won, of lives saved and hearts healed. It was a legacy worth every tear shed, every sleepless night, every moment of fear. Because in the end, love would always win, the truth would always prevail, and the light would always find a way to pierce the darkness, always.